What made conquered captives more valuable to expanding states than the land they once ruled? From the ancient empires of Mesopotamia to the early modern kingdoms of Europe, rulers faced a relentless challenge. How do you control vast, hostile territories filled with people who have every reason to resist? The answer was not simply force or fear. It was something far more calculated. It was the systematic reorganization of entire populations into instruments of stability. This was not random cruelty or mere exploitation. It was a deliberate political strategy born from the harsh realities of governance. But the true mechanisms behind these policies remain a complex and often misunderstood chapter of history. By watching this video, you will uncover the hidden logic that allowed some empires to transform potential rebels into loyal subjects, while others collapsed under the weight of their own conquests. You will discover why certain captive groups resisted assimilation for generations, and what that resistance reveals about human identity. What do you think separates a strategy that stabilizes an empire from one that sows the seeds of its destruction? The answer begins with a simple but brutal arithmetic of power. An expanding state could not afford to treat every conquered individual as an enemy. The logistics alone were impossible. Armies required food, roads needed maintenance, fields demanded planting, and all of this required people working together, not fighting back. A ruler who killed or enslaved everyone in a newly captured region would destroy the very resources he needed to sustain his conquest. At the same time, leaving the population completely free to resist would invite constant rebellion, draining military strength and bankrupting the treasury. The solution was a calculated middle path: reorganize the captive population so that their daily existence became intertwined with the state's survival. This was not charity or cruelty for its own sake. It was a strategic necessity. By placing captives into roles that supported the empire, whether as farmers on state lands, artisans in royal workshops, or soldiers in auxiliary units, rulers simultaneously solved their labor shortages and reduced the risk of uprising. A farmer who depends on the empire for seed and protection is far less likely to pick up a weapon against it. A soldier who receives pay and land from the emperor has a direct stake in the emperor's success. In this way, the very act of reorganization created a web of mutual dependence. The captive gained a new place in the world, however limited, while the state gained a steady supply of labor and a pool of potential loyalists. But this strategy carried hidden dangers. What happened when the reorganization itself created new forms of resentment, or when the roles assigned to captives became permanent markers of inferiority, breeding quiet rebellion across generations? The answer reveals the fragile balance at the heart of every ambitious empire. The earliest experiments in captive reorganization began in the ancient Near East, long before any empire had a name for the strategy. Among the Sumerian city-states and later the Akkadian realm, conquerors discovered something powerful by accident. When they seized a rival city, they faced the usual problem of how to control a hostile population. But instead of simply slaughtering or enslaving everyone, some rulers began targeting specific groups for relocation. Skilled workers, artisans, metalworkers, and weavers were especially valuable. So too were the families of local rulers and the priestly class. By deporting these individuals to their own capital cities, the conqueror achieved two goals at once. The defeated region lost its leaders and its most talented producers, making organized resistance far more difficult. Meanwhile, the conqueror's own economy gained a sudden infusion of expertise. A potter forced to work in the royal workshops of Ur or Akkad would produce goods that enriched the state. A former prince, now living under watch in the conqueror's court, could no longer rally his people to war. These early efforts were ad hoc, driven more by opportunity than by any formal policy. but they revealed a truth that later rulers would study carefully. Captives were not just a burden or a threat, they were a resource that could be reshaped and redirected. The practice was experimental, sometimes clumsy, and it did not always work. Resentment could fester, and escape or rebellion remained constant risks. Yet the basic principle was clear. By separating the most influential and skilled members of a conquered society and placing them in new roles within the conqueror's world, an expanding state could weaken its enemies while strengthening itself. This was the seed of a strategy that would grow far more sophisticated in the centuries to come. And as empires grew larger and more ambitious, they would begin to formalize these ad hoc measures into something much more systematic. But it was the Neo-Assyrian Empire that turned this strategy into a science. Over the course of the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, Assyrian kings perfected a system of demographic engineering that would become a template for empires to come. When their armies marched into a rebellious province or a newly conquered land, they did not simply impose tribute and leave a garrison. Instead, they enacted a policy of mass relocation that was breathtaking in its scale and precision. Entire communities were uprooted from their ancestral homes and marched hundreds of miles to distant regions of the empire. The goal was not punishment but transformation. By removing a population from the familiar landscapes of their gods, their ancestors, and their local leaders, the Assyrians severed the deep roots that bound a people to their identity. A farmer from the mountains of what is now western Iran might find himself resettled in the plains of northern Mesopotamia. A craftsman from the Levant could end up in a newly founded city in the heart of Assyria itself. And here is where the strategy became truly sophisticated. The Assyrians did not simply dump these displaced groups into random locations. They carefully mixed them with other relocated peoples from different regions. Speakers of different languages, worshippers of different gods, practitioners of different trades were all thrown together in new settlements. This deliberate mixing made it nearly impossible for any single group to organize resistance. Shared language and shared grievance, the usual ingredients of rebellion, were diluted to the point of uselessness. At the same time, each individual was assigned a specific role within the Assyrian economic machine. Some worked on massive state-run farms, producing grain for the army. Others labored in royal workshops, weaving textiles or forging weapons. Still others were drafted into auxiliary military units, where they served under Assyrian officers far from their original homelands. In this way, the captive became a cog in a system that rewarded cooperation and punished disloyalty. Over time, identities began to shift. A child born in the new settlement might never learn the old language or the old stories. The economic incentives were clear. Loyalty to the empire meant security, a steady ration, and a place in the world. The Assyrian blueprint was not without its costs, of course. Uprooting entire populations created immense hardship, and resistance did occur. But the Assyrians refined their methods with each campaign, learning which groups to move, where to send them, and how to integrate them most effectively. The results were undeniable. The Neo-Assyrian Empire grew to become the largest and most powerful state the world had yet seen, and its stability rested in no small part on the shoulders of these reorganized populations. Later empires would study this model carefully. The Babylonians, the Persians, and even the Romans would adopt and adapt the Assyrian approach, but they could never fully replicate its brutal efficiency. What lessons did these later powers draw from the Assyrian blueprint, and how did they modify it to suit their own needs? The answer lies in the rise of the Persian Empire, where a new philosophy of governance would transform deportation into a tool of integration rather than simply control. The Babylonian Captivity stands as one of history's most carefully documented experiments in elite reorganization. When Nebuchadnezzar II marched against Jerusalem in the early 6th century before the Common Era, he did not simply destroy the city and scatter its people. Instead, his forces targeted a very specific segment of Judean society: the king, the priests, the scribes, the craftsmen, and the wealthy landowners were rounded up and marched eastward across the desert toward the heart of the Babylonian Empire. These were not random prisoners of war. They were the very people who held Judean society together. The decision to remove them was a masterstroke of strategic thinking. Without its educated elite, Jerusalem could not organize a rebellion. Without its religious leaders, the people could not rally around a common cause. Without its artisans and administrators, the local economy would falter. But the Babylonians did not intend to destroy these captives. They intended to use them. Once they arrived in Babylon, the Judean elites were not thrown into slave camps or forced into hard labor. Instead, they were resettled in designated districts near the capital, where they were allowed to maintain their own homes, their own customs, and their own places of worship. They could marry, raise children, and practice their trade. Some even rose to positions of influence within the imperial bureaucracy. The Babylonian administration saw value in preserving the skills and knowledge these captives possessed. Scribes trained in Hebrew and Aramaic could help manage the empire's multilingual correspondence. Craftsmen skilled in metalworking and weaving could supply the royal workshops. Merchants with connections to trade routes across the Levant could help sustain the imperial economy. In exchange for this relative stability, the Judean elite was expected to remain loyal and to refrain from political agitation. They were allowed to keep their identity but not their power. This was not a policy of erasure. It was a policy of containment and redirection. Over the decades that followed, a fascinating dynamic emerged. The Judean community in Babylon did not disappear or fully assimilate. Instead, it transformed. With no temple to serve as the center of worship, religious life shifted toward the study of sacred texts and the observance of communal rituals. Prophets like Ezekiel emerged to guide the people through their loss and displacement, offering new interpretations of their covenant with their God. The experience of exile became a defining narrative, a shared memory that would shape Jewish identity for generations to come. For the Babylonians, the strategy worked remarkably well. The Judean captives, stripped of their political and military leaders, posed little threat to the empire. Yet the very preservation of their cultural identity sowed the seeds of future resilience. When the Persian Empire later conquered Babylon and allowed the Judeans to return to their homeland, many chose to stay. They had built new lives, new communities, and new ways of understanding themselves. The Babylonian policy of reorganization had succeeded beyond its original aims, transforming a conquered people into a network of loyal and productive subjects, while inadvertently strengthening the cultural bonds that would outlast the empire itself. This case reveals a profound truth about captive reorganization. The most effective strategies are not those that crush identity, but those that redirect it toward ends the empire can control. What happens, though, when a captive population refuses to accept that redirection? The answer lies in the Roman approach to conquered peoples, where the embrace of imperial identity came with a price that not everyone was willing to pay. One empire before Rome had already found an answer, and it looked nothing like the Assyrian blueprint. When Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era, he did not repeat the familiar pattern of mass deportation and forced resettlement. Instead, he reversed it. In a move that surprised both his own officials and the subject peoples, Cyrus issued a decree allowing the captive populations held in Babylon, including the Judeans, to return to their ancestral homelands. He did not simply open the gates, he actively encouraged their departure, even providing resources for rebuilding temples and restoring local governance. This was not an act of generosity in the modern sense. It was a calculated strategic decision rooted in a deep understanding of what truly stabilizes an expanding state. Cyrus recognized that a population allowed to govern itself to practice its own traditions, and to live on its own land would have far less reason to rebel than one forcibly relocated and placed under constant surveillance. Coerced labor and cultural erasure created resentment that simmered for generations. Self-rule, on the other hand, created a sense of investment. A community that could manage its own affairs, collect its own taxes, and worship its own gods was a community that saw the Persian Empire not as an occupying force but as a legitimate authority. The key was loyalty, not submission, and loyalty, Cyrus understood, could be earned through respect far more reliably than through fear. The Persians implemented this philosophy on a massive scale. Instead of imposing Persian governors on every conquered region, they often appointed local leaders, drawn from the very populations their predecessors had tried to uproot. These local administrators collected tribute, maintained order, and reported to the Persian king. But they did so with the trust of their own people because they spoke the language and understood the customs. This system, known today as indirect rule, allowed the Persian Empire to govern an enormous territory with a relatively small military presence. It was efficient, cost-effective, and remarkably stable. The empire stretched from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Mediterranean, yet it faced fewer large-scale rebellions than the much smaller Assyrian state had endured. The lesson was clear: reorganization did not always mean forced relocation. Sometimes it meant strategic empowerment. By giving captive populations a stake in the empire's success, the Persians turned former enemies into partners. The Judeans, for example, returned to Jerusalem with Persian backing and rebuilt their temple. They remained loyal subjects for centuries, serving as a buffer and a bridge between the Persian heartland and the volatile regions of the eastern Mediterranean. This was reorganization of a different kind, one that reshaped not where people lived but how they participated in the imperial system. The Persian experiment set a lasting precedent. Later empires, from the Hellenistic kingdoms to the Romans themselves, would study this model carefully. They would learn that a captive population, when given meaningful autonomy and a sense of shared purpose, could become one of the empire's greatest assets. But the balance between empowerment and control was delicate. Pushed too far toward autonomy, and the empire risked losing its grip. Pushed too far toward coercion, and the old resentments would resurface. The Persians had found a middle ground that worked for their time. The question that remained for those who followed was whether they could maintain that balance as their own empires grew ever larger and more diverse. Alexander the Great inherited this Persian balance and pushed it further. When his armies swept across the vast reaches of the old Persian Empire, he faced a dilemma that would define his entire reign. How do you hold together an army of Macedonians and Greeks who saw themselves as conquerors while also governing millions of Persians, Egyptians, and Babylonians who saw the newcomers as foreign invaders? Alexander understood that force alone would never create lasting stability, so he attempted something unprecedented. He would try to fuse the conquerors and the conquered into a single ruling class, using marriage, settlement, and culture as his tools. The most dramatic example of this policy unfolded in the city of Susa, in what is now western Iran, in the year 324 before the Common Era. Alexander orchestrated a mass wedding ceremony that involved thousands of his Macedonian officers and soldiers taking Persian brides. He himself married 2 Persian princesses, daughters of the defeated king Darius III. The event was not a private affair. It was a carefully staged public spectacle meant to send a clear message. The old divisions between Greek and Persian were to be erased. The future of this new empire would be built on mixed bloodlines and shared loyalties. For the soldiers, the marriages brought land, status, and a personal stake in the stability of the realm. For the Persian aristocracy, these unions offered a path back to influence under the new regime. In theory, it was a brilliant solution. In practice, it was far more complicated. Many Macedonian soldiers resented the idea of marrying women they considered enemies. The marriages were often forced or coerced, and resentment simmered beneath the surface. After Alexander died just a few years later, many of these unions were quickly dissolved. The experiment with mass marriage revealed a fundamental tension at the heart of his vision. You could not simply decree a new identity into existence. Loyalty, trust, and cultural blending required time and generations to take root. At the same time, Alexander and his successors undertook a massive program of city building across the conquered territories. The most famous of these was Alexandria in Egypt, founded in 331 before the Common Era. But Alexandria was not just a military outpost. It was deliberately designed as a melting pot. Alexander invited Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and Persians to settle there, granting them certain rights and privileges if they agreed to live side by side. The city was laid out on a grid with separate quarters for different ethnic groups, but the public spaces, the markets, the gymnasiums, and later the famous library were meant to bring people together. The goal was to create a new kind of citizen, one who might identify not with a tribe or a region, but with the Hellenistic world itself. This was cultural syncretism as a deliberate state policy. Greek language became the common tongue of administration and trade. Greek art and philosophy mixed with Egyptian religion and Persian governance. New gods emerged like Serapis who blended Greek and Egyptian features. For a time, this fusion worked remarkably well. Alexandria became one of the greatest centers of learning and commerce in the ancient world. The stability it enjoyed for centuries was a testament to the power of shared culture to bridge old divides. Yet the limits of this experiment were everywhere. The Greek settlers and the local populations rarely mixed as equals. Greeks held the highest positions in government and the military, while Egyptians and other native peoples filled the lower ranks of the bureaucracy and the labor force. Intermarriage did happen, but it was often frowned upon by both sides. The Greek colonists built their own schools, their own temples, and their own social clubs, keeping themselves separate from the people they lived among. Over time, resentment grew. The very cultural blending that Alexander had hoped would unify his empire instead created a new kind of hierarchy, one that privileged Greek identity above all others. When the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt after Alexander, faced internal revolts, they often came from the native Egyptian population who felt excluded from power. The Greek colonies scattered across Asia faced similar tensions. Cities founded by Greek settlers in Afghanistan and India maintained their Greek character for generations, but they remained islands in a sea of local cultures. True integration rarely happened. The descendants of Alexander's soldiers and the descendants of the conquered peoples lived side by side, but they did not become one. What does this tell us about the limits of reorganization through cultural mixing? The Greeks had the tools and the vision to create a new world, but they could not overcome the human instinct for hierarchy and belonging. A policy that works on paper often stumbles on the ground, where old loyalties and new resentments shape daily life. The Hellenistic kingdoms would eventually fall to the Romans, not because they lacked cultural ambition, but because they could not resolve the fundamental question that haunted every expanding state. How do you make a captive population feel like they truly belong without losing your own sense of identity? The Romans would face this same question, and their answer would reshape the world for centuries to come. The Roman answer was forged in the heat of conquest and the weight of necessity. Where the Greeks had tried cultural blending, Rome turned to a far more systematic and ruthless engine of reorganization: mass slavery. As the Republic expanded across the Mediterranean in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, its armies generated captives on a scale never before seen. Entire cities were emptied. Whole populations of rebellious provinces were marched back to Italy and distributed like cargo. These were not just prisoners of war. They were the raw material for a new economic order, one that would transform the Roman world and leave scars that lasted for generations. The centerpiece of this system was the latifundium, the vast agricultural estate that came to dominate the Italian countryside. Before the Great Conquests, Roman farming had been largely carried out by small landholders who worked their own plots. But as captured slaves flooded into Italy by the hundreds of thousands, wealthy landowners saw an opportunity. They bought up the lands of displaced peasants, many of whom had been driven off their farms by decades of military service, and consolidated them into enormous estates. On these latifundia, slaves worked the fields in organized gangs, producing grain, olives, and wine for the Roman market. The efficiency was undeniable. A single estate managed by a slave overseer could produce far more than a patchwork of small farms, but the social cost was staggering. The free peasantry, the backbone of the Roman army, was pushed aside. Entire regions of Italy were depopulated of their original inhabitants, replaced by an imported workforce with no ties to the land and no stake in the community. Rome did not stop at agriculture. The silver mines of Spain, the copper mines of Cyprus, the marble quarries of Greece, all became sites of forced labor on an industrial scale. Captives from conquered tribes were sent deep underground, where they worked in conditions that few survived for long. The output of these mines fueled the Roman economy, supplying the metal for coinage, the stone for monuments, and the wealth that funded further conquests. Public works projects, the aqueducts, the roads, the temples, the amphitheaters, were also built largely by the hands of captives. Every arch and every column stood as a monument not just to Roman engineering, but to the reorganization of human beings into tools of state power. A traveler walking along the Appian Way in the 1st century of the Common Era would have seen gangs of laborers in chains, repairing the road that carried Roman legions to the frontiers. The message was clear: this empire was built by those it had conquered. But slavery in Rome was not only an economic system, it was also a deliberate instrument of pacification. When a region rebelled, Rome often responded by selling the entire population into bondage, scattering them across the empire where they could never again unite. This was a form of demographic warfare. Remove the people and the land becomes silent. The city of Carthage, after its destruction in the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, was not just razed. Its surviving inhabitants were sold into slavery and dispersed throughout the Mediterranean. The same fate befell countless other communities that resisted Roman rule. Over time, the very memory of these peoples faded, replaced by the Latin language and Roman customs that their descendants, if they survived, were forced to adopt. Cultural erasure happened not through decree, but through the slow grinding of generations. A child born into slavery on a Sicilian latifundium might never learn the language of his ancestors. He might grow up speaking a rough Latin, worshipping Roman gods, and knowing no other home than the estate where he worked. His identity was not destroyed in a single violent moment. It was dissolved drop by drop over a lifetime. The impact on Roman society itself was profound and paradoxical. The influx of captives enriched the elite, but it also created deep instability. The great slave revolts, like the one led by Spartacus in the late 1st century before the Common Era, were direct consequences of this reorganization. Tens of thousands of enslaved people rose up, not because they were cruelly treated in every case, but because they had been ripped from their homes and placed into a system that offered no path to belonging. Rome eventually crushed these revolts with brutal efficiency, but the wounds never fully healed. The Roman economy became dependent on a constant supply of new captives from the frontiers. When the conquest slowed in the later empire, the entire system began to crack. The latifundia could not sustain themselves without fresh labor. The mines produced less. The roads fell into disrepair. The very foundation of Roman prosperity had been built on the reorganization of captive populations, and when that foundation shifted, the empire trembled. What did this mean for the people who lived through it, and how did the descendants of those captives, now generations removed from their origins, come to see themselves as Romans? The answer would emerge not in the fields or the mines, but in the cities where a different kind of transformation was taking place. But not every captive was sent to the fields or the mines. Some were given a sword and a uniform, and in doing so, they became the very backbone of the empire that had conquered them. The practice of recruiting captives into military service was one of the most ingenious and enduring strategies in the history of state building. It solved two problems at once. A restless population of young men who might otherwise become rebels were given a purpose and a place, and the state gained soldiers whose loyalty was not divided by local ties or family allegiances. A soldier recruited from his own homeland might hesitate to crush a rebellion in his own village. A soldier taken from a distant land with no ties to the people he was ordered to pacify had no such hesitation. His only loyalty was to the ruler who fed him, armed him, and gave him a new identity. The Romans understood this well. As the Republic expanded into an empire, it faced a growing demand for military manpower. The legions were filled with Roman citizens, but the frontiers required constant patrols and defensive forces. To meet this need, Rome turned to the auxilia, auxiliary units recruited from conquered peoples. Men from Gaul, Germany, Syria, and North Africa were organized into regiments of cavalry, archers, and light infantry, serving alongside the legions but separate from them. These auxiliaries were not volunteers in the modern sense. They were often conscripted from tribes that had been defeated in war or drawn from regions where the Roman presence was still fresh. But they were given a powerful incentive to serve faithfully. After 25 years of service, an auxiliary soldier and his family received Roman citizenship. This was a transformative reward. It meant that a man born into a conquered tribe could, through his loyalty, become a full member of the empire that had once been his enemy. His children would be Roman citizens, entitled to legal protections and opportunities that his ancestors never had. The promise of citizenship turned the auxiliary system into a machine for integration. Over generations, the descendants of these soldiers would forget their old loyalties and blend into the Roman world. The empire gained not just soldiers, but new citizens who had a direct stake in its survival. Centuries later, in the Islamic world, a similar logic produced one of the most famous military institutions in history, the Mamluks. The word Mamluk means one who is owned, and these soldiers were exactly that. They were enslaved young men, often from the steppes of Central Asia or the Caucasus, purchased as boys and brought to the courts of sultans and caliphs. There they were converted to Islam, given rigorous military training, and indoctrinated with absolute loyalty to their master. The logic was brutally simple. A Mamluk had no family, no tribe, no local connections in the land where he served. His entire world revolved around his training, his barracks, and his commander. He owed everything to the Sultan who had raised him from a foreign boy into a warrior. This made him fiercely loyal, far more reliable than a soldier recruited from the local population, who might have divided loyalties or political ambitions of his own. The Mamluks became the elite fighting force of many Islamic states, most famously in Egypt and Syria, where they eventually rose to power themselves, establishing a dynasty that ruled for centuries. But the principle remained the same. By taking captives and turning them into soldiers, rulers created a military caste that had no roots in the society they protected, and therefore no reason to challenge the throne from within. The most elaborate and enduring example of this strategy, however, came from the Ottoman Empire. The system was known as the Devshirme, a practice that began in the late 14th century and continued for over 300 years. In villages across the Balkan provinces of the Ottoman realm, Officials would periodically select Christian boys, usually between the ages of 8 and 18, based on their physical and intellectual promise. These boys were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and sent to the Ottoman capital for intensive training. They were not treated cruelly in the sense of being starved or beaten. The system was designed to produce loyalty, not resentment. They were given an education, taught Turkish and Arabic, trained in the arts of war, and instilled with a deep sense of devotion to the Sultan and to the empire. They were told that they were now part of a great brotherhood, a corps of servants who served the ruler directly. Their past lives were erased, and a new identity was forged in the crucible of the imperial household. The most famous product of this system was the Janissary Corps, the elite infantry of the Ottoman army. The Janissaries were not just soldiers, they were a distinct class, bound by strict rules of celibacy and discipline, housed in their own barracks and forbidden from marrying or engaging in trade. Their sole purpose was war, and their loyalty was to the Sultan alone. In battle, they were formidable. They were among the first armies in Europe to adopt firearms on a large scale, and their discipline and training made them a fearsome force. But their importance went beyond the battlefield. The Janissaries became a pillar of Ottoman stability, because they had no local ties, no families to protect, no villages to return to. They had no incentive to rebel in the name of a homeland they no longer remembered. Their entire identity was bound up in the empire that had created them. A Janissary who rose through the ranks could achieve immense power and wealth, but his status was entirely dependent on the Sultan's favor. This made him a reliable instrument of state policy, a tool that could be used to crush rebellions, enforce taxes, and maintain order across the vast Ottoman domains. The Devshirme system was not without its costs, of course. Families in the Balkans lived in fear of the recruiters, and many tried to hide their sons or bribe officials to avoid selection. The loss of a child, even to a system that promised advancement, was a profound hardship. But for the boys who were taken, the path offered a remarkable opportunity. Some rose to become Grand Viziers, the highest officials in the empire, commanding armies and governing provinces. They were no longer captives in any meaningful sense. They were the architects of the state that had once taken them. The system turned potential enemies into the empire's most loyal defenders, not by breaking their will, but by giving them a new world to belong to. A world in which they had everything to gain and nothing to lose by serving faithfully. This was reorganization at its most sophisticated, and it worked for centuries, but no system lasts forever. What happened when the loyalties shifted and the Janissaries themselves became a force for instability? The answer reveals the hidden weakness at the heart of this remarkable strategy. A weakness that would eventually bring the Ottoman Empire to its knees. While the Janissaries marched for the Sultan, other captives toiled in places most soldiers never saw. The reorganization of captive populations was not only a military or political strategy. It was also a vast economic engine, one that powered the mines, fields, and roads of empires for centuries. Expanding states understood that certain kinds of work were too dangerous, too exhausting, or too remote to attract free laborers. The solution was to direct captive populations into these roles, extracting maximum value while physically isolating them from the rest of society. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate design that turned hardship into profit and distance into control. Consider the silver mines of Roman Spain. In the first centuries of the Common Era, the Iberian Peninsula was one of the wealthiest provinces in the empire, but its wealth came at a terrible cost. The silver mines near Cartagena and other sites required immense effort to reach the ore. Workers descended deep underground where the air was thin and the light was scarce. They hacked at rock faces by lamplight, hauling heavy baskets of ore back up narrow shafts. Free Roman citizens rarely took these jobs. They could earn a living farming or serving in the legions with far less risk. So the empire filled the mines with captives, men and women taken from conquered tribes across the Mediterranean and the frontiers. These captives were organized into work gangs, each overseen by a foreman who reported directly to imperial officials. The system was ruthlessly efficient. The mines produced silver that funded the legions, paid for public works, and stabilized the currency. The captives, isolated deep underground or in fortified settlements near the mine entrances, had little chance to organize or escape. Their labor was a hidden pillar of Roman power, invisible to most citizens but essential to the empire's survival. Centuries later and across the sea, another crop became the engine of a different kind of reorganization. Sugar cane had been cultivated in the Mediterranean for centuries, but by the late Middle Ages, demand from European markets exploded. Sugar was a luxury, a sweetener for the tables of the wealthy, but it required an immense amount of labor to produce. The cane had to be harvested at precisely the right moment, then crushed, boiled, and refined in a process that was hot, dangerous, and exhausting. Free peasants in Cyprus, Crete, and Sicily were reluctant to take on such work. So states and private landowners turned to captives. The Crusades and the wars between Christian and Muslim powers provided a steady stream of prisoners of war. These captives were sent to the sugar plantations, where they worked in organized gangs under constant supervision. The plantation itself became a kind of fortress, with fields surrounded by walls or guarded watchtowers. Captives were housed in barracks near the processing mills, kept separate from the local population to prevent escape or rebellion. The sugar they produced was shipped across the Mediterranean, fetching high prices that made the system profitable for the landowner and tax revenue for the crown. This model would later be transplanted across the Atlantic, where it grew into something far larger and more brutal. But its roots lay in these early Mediterranean experiments, where the reorganization of captive labor turned a luxury crop into a cornerstone of state wealth. On the other side of the world, the Inca Empire faced a similar challenge. Their vast network of roads, stretching over 25,000 miles across the Andes, required constant maintenance. These roads were not simple dirt paths. They were engineered marvels with stone pavements, suspension bridges, and drainage systems that allowed armies and messengers to move quickly through some of the most rugged terrain on Earth. But keeping them in good condition required a massive workforce. Free Inca subjects were already busy farming, serving in the military, or working on state projects as part of the meter labor tax. To fill the gap, the empire turned to captive populations from conquered regions. After a successful campaign, the Inca would relocate entire communities to areas near the road network. These captives were assigned specific stretches of road to maintain. They cleared landslides, repaired broken stones, and rebuilt bridges after heavy rains. They lived in small settlements right next to the road, far from their original homes, with no means of returning. Their only connection to the wider world was the very road they maintained. The Inca state provided them with food and tools, but they were isolated, their movements restricted, their identities slowly reshaped by the daily rhythm of labor. This was not punishment. It was a practical solution to a logistical problem, but it was also a form of control. A captive workforce that spent its days repairing roads had no time or energy to plan rebellion. And the roads themselves, the arteries of the empire, were kept open for the armies that enforced Inca rule. The logistical systems that supported these operations were as carefully designed as the work itself. When captives were relocated to a mine or a plantation, they did not simply walk there on their own. They were moved in organized columns, often under armed guard, along predetermined routes. These forced marches could last weeks or even months, depending on the distance. Captives were allowed to rest at designated camps, where they received minimal food and water. The camps themselves were temporary structures, often just open enclosures with basic shelters, but they served a critical purpose. They allowed officials to count, sort, and reassign captives before sending them to their final destination. At the mines, permanent camps became small towns. Workers lived in barracks arranged around a central courtyard where they were fed and watched. Guards patrolled the perimeter. Anyone who tried to escape faced severe consequences. This combination of physical isolation, constant surveillance, and exhausting labor created an environment where resistance was nearly impossible. The captives' world shrank to the mine shaft, the field, or the road. They had no energy for anything beyond survival. Yet even in these conditions, the human spirit found ways to endure. Over generations, these remote work sites developed their own cultures, blending the languages and traditions of the many captive groups thrown together. In the Spanish mines, workers from different tribes learned a common pidgin to communicate. On the sugar plantations, songs and stories from distant homelands were shared during rare moments of rest. Along the Inca roads, families who had been relocated together passed down memories of the mountains they had left behind. The states that built these systems intended to erase identity, but they could not entirely succeed. The camps and plantations became places of slow transformation, not just of control but of adaptation. And as these captive populations settled into their new roles, they also became something else, a permanent workforce that the state could not easily replace. The dependence on captive labor grew deeper with each passing generation. What happened when the supply of new captives slowed, or when the existing workforce grew old and exhausted? The answer to that question would reshape entire economies and, in some cases, help bring down the very empires that had built them. The most enduring conquests were not of land but of language and belief. An empire could move a population across a continent, assign them new jobs, and even enlist them in its armies. But if the captives continued to speak their old tongue, whisper their old prayers, and pass on their old stories to their children, the conqueror had only won a temporary victory. The true prize was the slow, patient remaking of the human heart. That is why, alongside forced relocation and economic reorganization, every great empire developed deliberate strategies to reshape the cultural and religious identities of those it had conquered. These strategies were not afterthoughts. They were as carefully planned as any military campaign, because rulers understood that a captive who no longer remembered who he was could never seriously threaten the state. The Assyrians were among the first to understand this on a grand scale. When they dispersed conquered peoples across their empire, they did not simply leave them to their own devices in new settlements. They actively worked to create a common language that would bind the empire together. That language was Aramaic. In the centuries before the Assyrian rise, the Near East had been a patchwork of dozens of local tongues. After the Assyrian conquests, Aramaic became the language of administration, trade, and daily communication across huge stretches of territory. A captive from the mountains of what is now Armenia, resettled in the plains of Syria, would find that the officials who issued his rations, the merchants who sold him goods, and the neighbors who shared his new village all used Aramaic. Over time, his old language faded from use, first in public, then in private, until his grandchildren could not understand the songs of their ancestors. The Assyrian policy was not a ban in the modern sense. There were no official decrees forbidding other languages, but the practical reality of daily life made Aramaic indispensable, and that gentle pressure was far more effective than any violent suppression. The captive did not need to be forced to forget. The system simply made remembering inconvenient. Religious conversion played an even deeper role in the reorganization of identity. The Islamic empires that rose after the 7th century perfected this approach, and they did so with a sophistication that earlier states could only envy. In the Ottoman Empire, the Devshirme system took Christian boys and transformed them into Muslim servants of the Sultan. The conversion was not superficial. These boys were immersed in an Islamic education from childhood. they learned the Quran, studied Arabic, and participated in the daily rhythms of prayer and fasting. Their old religion, with its feast days and saints and rituals, was gradually replaced. By the time a Janissary took up his sword, he was a Muslim not just in name but in habit and identity. The same pattern appeared in the Mughal Empire in India. When the Mughals conquered Hindu kingdoms, they did not always force mass conversion on the general population. Instead, they focused on the elites and on captives taken in war. Young men of warrior castes were brought into the imperial household, converted to Islam, and trained as cavalrymen or administrators. They were given new names and new clothes, taught Persian, the language of the court, and expected to adopt the customs of their new masters. Over a generation or two, these families became indistinguishable from the Mughal aristocracy. The conversion was a bridge across old divides, a way to turn a potential enemy into a loyal supporter whose entire worldview had been reshaped. In the Americas, the Spanish approach to captive populations took a different form, but the goal was the same. After the conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires, the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church launched a massive effort to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. This was not a gentle invitation. Captives who resisted could face severe consequences, but the strategy was not simply about coercion. The Spanish built churches on the foundations of destroyed temples. They trained indigenous children in Spanish-language schools where they learned Latin and Catholic doctrine. They encouraged and often forced marriages between Spanish settlers and indigenous women, creating a new class of people known as mestizos who had loyalties to both worlds. The old gods were not exactly outlawed in a single decree. Instead, they were gradually pushed aside by a relentless tide of ritual and instruction. A captive who was baptized, given a Spanish name, and married to a Spanish soldier found that the traditions of his ancestors became distant memories. His children would grow up speaking Spanish, attending Mass, and identifying not with a conquered tribe but with the empire that had adopted them. This cultural reorganization was as important as any battle in securing Spanish control over the Americas. The land was vast and the Spanish population was tiny. They could not have held it by force alone. They held it by transforming the identities of the people who lived there. What made these strategies so effective was their ability to work across generations. A captive who converted as an adult might still cling to old loyalties in secret, but his children, raised entirely within the new system, had no such conflict. They did not remember the old language, they did not know the old prayers. Their world was the world of the conqueror. Over time, the very concept of captivity faded. The descendants of those who had been conquered became loyal subjects, even enthusiastic defenders of the empire that had remade them. This is why cultural reorganization was never an afterthought. It was the final, necessary step in turning a hostile population into a stable part of an expanding state. But even the most thorough assimilation had its limits. Some captive groups found ways to preserve their identity in the cracks and margins of the imperial system. And when they did, they created a tension that would challenge the empires that thought they had conquered everything. What forms did that hidden resistance take, and how did it shape the world that came after? The answer lies in the quiet persistence of memory. The memory of a homeland could be the most dangerous force an empire faced. A captive who dreamed of returning to his ancestral valley, who whispered old songs to his children, who marked the passing of seasons by the festivals of a lost world, was a captive who might one day rise up. The most sophisticated reorganizers understood this, and they designed their systems not just to move people, but to rearrange the very map of belonging. They did this through a strategy that historians call demographic engineering, and no empire practiced it with more precision than the Inca. The Inca called their system mitmaq, a Quechua word that means to send or to transplant. It was not a single policy but a flexible set of practices that the Inca state used to manage the vast and diverse populations under its control. At its core was a simple insight: stability came not from leaving conquered peoples where they were and hoping they would stay quiet, but from deliberately rearranging who lived where. The Inca did not just deport captives, they also moved loyal subjects into newly conquered territories, creating a human mosaic that made rebellion nearly impossible. Imagine the aftermath of a successful Inca campaign. The emperor in Cusco received word that a province in the highlands had been subdued. The local leaders had been captured or killed. The armies had withdrawn, but the work of consolidation was just beginning. Inca officials would survey the conquered region, counting villages, assessing resources, and identifying potential troublemakers. Then the orders would come. Entire communities of loyal subjects, families who had lived for generations in the heartland near Cusco, were told to pack their belongings and prepare for a long journey. They would be resettled in the newly conquered province, sometimes hundreds of miles away. These loyalist settlers were chosen carefully. They were Quechua speakers, the language of the Inca elite. They practiced the state religion, which centered on the sun god Inti. They knew how to build the terraces and irrigation canals that made Inca agriculture so productive. They were, in effect, living tools of imperial integration. When they arrived in their new home, they were given land, seeds, and tools. They built new villages laid out according to Inca urban planning, with a central plaza and a storehouse for imperial goods. They married into local families, taught Quechua to their neighbors, and introduced the rituals of the Inca state. Over a generation or two, the conquered region began to look and sound like a miniature version of the Inca heartland. But the mitmaq system was not a one-way street. It was a two-way process designed to drain the swamp of resistance. While loyalists moved in, potentially rebellious populations were moved out. The Inca would identify tribes or communities that had resisted conquest fiercely or had a history of uprising. They would not simply punish these groups with executions or enslavement. Instead, they would order a mass relocation. Entire villages, sometimes thousands of people, were marched from their ancestral homelands to new settlements deep in the Inca heartland, far from their allies and familiar terrain. There, they were surrounded by loyal Inca subjects and placed under the watchful eyes of imperial administrators. This was a devastating psychological blow. A community uprooted from the mountains where their ancestors were buried, from the valleys where their gods spoke through wind and water, lost not just its physical home but its sense of itself. The old songs had no meaning in a new landscape. The rituals tied to specific peaks and rivers became hollow gestures. The leaders who had once guided the community were now strangers in a strange land, dependent on the Inca for food and protection. Resentment might simmer, but organized rebellion became nearly impossible. The people were scattered, their cohesion shattered, their identity slowly dissolving into the larger Inca world. The mitmaq system was not applied uniformly. The Inca were pragmatic. Some conquered groups were left largely in place if they submitted peacefully and provided tribute without trouble. Others faced partial relocation, with only the most influential families or the most skilled artisans being moved. The size and distance of the relocation varied depending on the perceived threat. A particularly rebellious tribe might be sent to the far edges of the empire, where they would serve as a buffer against hostile neighbors. A community that was seen as merely troublesome might be relocated just a few valleys away, close enough to be watched but not so far as to cause unnecessary hardship. The Inca calibrated their response with a careful eye on cost and benefit. This two-way movement of populations created a remarkable stability. The Inca Empire stretched for over 2,000 miles along the spine of the Andes, encompassing hundreds of different ethnic groups speaking dozens of languages. It was one of the most diverse political entities the world had ever seen. yet it experienced relatively few large-scale rebellions compared to other empires of similar size. The mitmaq system was a key reason. By mixing loyalists and potential rebels, by breaking up old networks and creating new ones, the Inca prevented the formation of the kind of solidary opposition that could threaten the state. A rebel leader might find his followers scattered across 1,000 miles. A potential uprising might be drowned in a sea of loyal Inca subjects before it could even begin. The Inca also used the mitmaq system to manage economic resources. Communities of skilled artisans, weavers, metalworkers, and potters were moved to areas where their products were needed or where raw materials were abundant. They worked under the supervision of Inca officials, producing goods for the state warehouses that fed the army and supported the imperial bureaucracy. Agricultural communities were moved to lands that needed development, building terraces on steep slopes and digging canals to bring water to arid valleys. The state provided food and tools during the transition period, ensuring that the relocated communities could survive until their first harvest. This was not charity. It was an investment in long-term productivity that paid dividends for generations. The Inca were not alone in practicing demographic engineering. The Roman Empire moved veteran soldiers to frontier colonies, creating loyal communities that could defend the borders and spread Roman culture. The Chinese empires of the Han and Tang dynasties relocated conquered peoples from the northern steppes to the agricultural heartland, where they could be assimilated and monitored. The Assyrians, as we have seen, scattered conquered populations across their empire, but the Inca version was remarkable for its scale, its sophistication, and its integration into every aspect of imperial life. The mitmaq was not a separate policy. It was woven into the fabric of Inca governance, a tool that was used alongside tribute collection, road building, and religious conversion to create a unified imperial identity. What made this system so enduring was its subtlety. The Inca did not simply crush resistance through force. They reshaped the human geography of their empire, gradually and patiently, until the old loyalties faded and new ones took root. A child born in a mitmaq settlement might never know the name of his ancestors' homeland. He would speak Quechua, worship in Thai, and serve the Inca emperor without a second thought. The conquest was completed not in a single battle, but over generations of quiet transformation. And yet, even this carefully managed system had its limits. What happened when the Inca Empire itself faced a threat it could not digest? The answer to that question would come from across the sea, in the form of strangers who understood the power of demographic engineering in ways the Inca could never have imagined. The Mongol approach was different, and it reshaped the world in a single generation. When Genghis Khan and his successors swept across Asia, they did not simply shatter cities and leave ruin in their wake. They had a keen eye for talent. Among the captives taken in the chaos of conquest, certain individuals were singled out not for punishment but for preservation. Artisans who worked in gold and silver, engineers who understood how to divert rivers or build siege weapons, scholars who could read the stars, keep accounts, or administer a kingdom. These were not just prisoners, they were assets, and the Mongols treated them as the most valuable plunder of all. The key to this strategy was its selectivity. The Mongols were supremely practical. They had little interest in the cultural or religious beliefs of the people they conquered. What they wanted was expertise. A Persian bureaucrat who had spent decades managing the complex tax systems of the Islamic world knew things that no Mongol herder could learn in a lifetime. A Chinese engineer who understood gunpowder and siege warfare could open the gates of a fortress that had resisted years of assault. These individuals were not destroyed. They were relocated, sometimes across vast distances, from the cities of Persia to the heart of the Mongol capital at Karakoram, from the workshops of China to the new cities springing up in Central Asia. The relocation was not random. It was a carefully managed system of knowledge transfer that made the Mongol Empire the most connected state the world had ever seen. Consider what happened when the Mongols conquered the Khwarezmian Empire in the early 13th century. Among the captives were Persian scribes, accountants, and administrators who had run one of the most sophisticated bureaucratic systems in the Islamic world. Instead of being killed or sold, they were sent eastward to serve in the courts of the Mongol Khans. There, they introduced Persian methods of record-keeping, taxation, and postal communication. These practices were then adapted and spread across the empire, from the gates of Baghdad to the plains of Mongolia. A few decades later, when the Mongols turned their attention to the Song dynasty in southern China, the process repeated in reverse. Chinese engineers who mastered the art of building massive stone walls and canals were shipped westward. They worked on irrigation projects in Persia that transformed arid landscapes into farmland. They designed siege engines that could break the walls of fortified cities. They brought with them knowledge of gunpowder, which would eventually reshape warfare across the entire Eurasian continent. This movement of skilled captives was not a one-time event. It was a continuous flow maintained for generations that turned the Mongol Empire into a giant engine of cross-cultural exchange. A Persian astronomer might find himself in Beijing, where he could observe the skies with Chinese instruments and develop new calendars that combined both traditions. A Chinese physician might be summoned to the court of a Mongol Khan in Persia, where his knowledge of pulse diagnosis and herbal medicine would be studied by Islamic doctors. The captives themselves often rose to positions of real influence. They became advisors to khans, governors of provinces, and even military commanders. Their expertise was their currency, and they spent it wisely. The Mongol rulers, for their part, understood that a captive who was given purpose and respect was far more valuable than a captive who was enslaved and broken. They provided these specialists with housing, food, and protection. They allowed them to practice their crafts and pursue their studies. In return, the specialists served the state with a loyalty that sometimes surprised even their new masters. This was reorganization at its most sophisticated, a system that transformed the intellectual and technological landscape of the medieval world. The effects of this policy were profound and lasting. The Mongol Empire did not simply conquer territory. It created a network of knowledge that connected East and West more intimately than ever before. The techniques of Persian administration helped stabilize Chinese governance. The inventions of Chinese engineers transformed Persian agriculture and warfare. In the crucible of the Mongol camps, where captives from a dozen different cultures worked side by side, new ideas were born, new methods were tested, and new ways of understanding the world took shape. The Mongol Empire, for all its violence and upheaval, became a bridge between civilizations, and that bridge was built, at least in part, by the hands of the very people it had conquered. The Inca took a different path, but their goal was the same. In the high Andes, where sheer cliffs and narrow valleys made movement difficult and communication slow, the Inca Empire faced a problem that no amount of military force could solve. How do you govern a territory that stretches over 2,000 miles, containing hundreds of distinct ethnic groups, each with its own language and traditions, when you have no system of writing and no wheeled vehicles? The answer was the mitmaq system, a policy of mass relocation so carefully planned that it still impresses archaeologists today. When Inca armies conquered a new province, they did not simply leave the local population in place and hope for the best. They set in motion a complex process of human rearrangement that would unfold over years. Loyal colonists, families who had lived for generations in the Inca heartland around Cusco, were selected for relocation. They packed their belongings, gathered their llamas, and marched to the newly conquered region. There, they built new villages laid out in the classic Inca style, with a central plaza, a storehouse for imperial goods, and terraced fields carved into the mountainsides. These loyalists brought Quechua, the language of the court, and the rituals of the sun god in Tai. They married into local families and taught their neighbors how to build the irrigation canals that made Inca agriculture so productive. Over time, the conquered region began to look and sound like an extension of the empire itself, but the mitmaq system worked in the opposite direction as well. Communities that had resisted conquest or whose leaders had shown signs of rebellion were themselves uprooted and sent to the Inca heartland. They were marched hundreds of miles, sometimes across passes over 16,000 feet high, to new settlements far from their ancestral lands. These relocated captives were placed in communities surrounded by loyal Inca subjects, where they could be watched and gradually resocialized. The psychological impact was immense. A people who had lived for generations in a particular valley, whose identity was tied to specific peaks and rivers, lost the physical anchor of their culture. The old songs no longer made sense in a new landscape. The rituals tied to local spirits became hollow gestures. Over a generation or two, the memory of the homeland faded, and the new generation grew up speaking Quechua and serving the emperor in Cusco. Archaeological evidence of this system has been found across the Andes. At sites like Huánuco Pampa, a provincial Inca center, researchers have uncovered distinct neighborhoods that correspond to different ethnic groups relocated from distant regions. The pottery styles, burial practices, and even the layout of houses reveal the origins of the people who lived there. In one area, you might find ceramics from the coast, brought by colonists resettled from the lowlands. In another, you might see the distinctive weaving patterns of highland groups moved from the southern reaches of the empire. These material traces tell a story of deliberate mixing, a human mosaic designed to prevent any single group from becoming strong enough to challenge imperial control. The mitmaq system was not a single policy applied uniformly. It was a flexible tool that Inca officials calibrated to the specific needs of each region. Sometimes they moved entire communities. Sometimes they moved only the most influential families, the leaders, the priests, and the skilled artisans, leaving the common people in place. The distance of relocation varied depending on the perceived threat. A particularly rebellious tribe might be sent to the far edges of the empire, where they would serve as a buffer against hostile neighbors. A community that was merely troublesome might be relocated just a few valleys away, close enough to be watched but not so far as to cause unnecessary hardship. The Inca measured their response with a careful eye on cost and benefit. This system was crucial because the Inca lacked two tools that other empires relied on heavily: writing and the wheel. Without writing, they could not send detailed administrative orders across vast distances. Without the wheel, they could not move heavy goods quickly. What they had instead was an extraordinary network of roads and a system of relay runners called chasquis who could carry messages across the empire in a matter of days. But even this network had limits. The real key to Inca stability was human relocation. By physically moving people, the Inca reshaped the social landscape in ways that made rebellion difficult and assimilation natural. A child born in a mitmaq settlement might never learn the name of his ancestors' homeland. He would grow up speaking Quechua, working the terraced fields his parents had built, and participating in festivals that honored in Tai. His loyalty would be to the emperor in Cusco, not to some distant valley he had never seen. The mitmaq system turned conquest into permanence, not through force but through the slow, patient work of generations. And it worked remarkably well. The Inca Empire experienced relatively few large-scale rebellions compared to other empires of similar size and diversity. The human mosaic they created was strong enough to hold together a realm of extraordinary complexity. But what happened when that mosaic was suddenly shattered by forces the Inca could never have anticipated? The answer would come from across the sea. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of reorganization was about to begin, one that would move more people across oceans than any previous empire had ever managed. The largest forced movement of human beings in history was not chaotic. It was a system built on a cold logic that European colonial powers refined over centuries. When the plantations of the Americas demanded labor on an unprecedented scale, the response was not random capture. It was a carefully organized network that sorted, priced, and distributed people according to their skills, their ethnic origins, and the specific needs of each colony. A sugar planter in Barbados did not simply want any laborer. He wanted someone who knew how to process cane, someone who could survive the tropical heat, and someone who came from a region far enough away that escape or rebellion would be nearly impossible. The traders who supplied these plantations learned to meet those demands with precision. They drew captives from specific coastal regions of West and Central Africa, often targeting groups known for their agricultural expertise or their resistance to disease. A skilled rice farmer from the interior of what is now Senegal and Gambia might be sent to the rice-growing lowlands of South Carolina, where his knowledge of irrigation and planting made him invaluable. A metal worker from the Gold Coast might end up in a Brazilian mining region where his skills could be applied to extracting gold. The sorting was not just about productivity. It was also about control. Captives from different ethnic groups were deliberately mixed in the holds of ships and on the plantations where they were sent. A Yoruba speaker might find himself working alongside an Igbo speaker and a Congo speaker. They could not easily communicate, and without a shared language, they could not easily organize a revolt. The same logic that the Assyrians had used centuries before, diluting rebellion through linguistic and cultural mixing, was now applied on a global scale. This system did not only reshape the Americas, it also transformed the societies that supplied the captives. In Africa, the demand for labor created by the Atlantic trade altered power dynamics in profound ways. Kingdoms and city-states that had once fought for land or tribute now fought for captives. Rulers who could capture and sell large numbers of people from rival communities gained access to European firearms, textiles, and other goods that made them more powerful than their neighbors. This created a feedback loop. The more captives a state could provide, the stronger it became, and the stronger it became, the more captives it could take. Some African states used this new source of wealth to stabilize their own expanding territories, just as the empires of the ancient world had done. The Oyo Empire in what is now Nigeria, for example, built a powerful cavalry army and used its military campaigns to capture thousands of individuals from neighboring regions. These captives were sold to European traders, and the proceeds funded the empire's growth. In the Asante Empire, the capture and sale of captives from rival states became an integral part of the economy, and the central government used the resulting wealth to consolidate its control over a vast territory. The reorganization of human beings into a commodity was not a one-sided story. It involved willing participants at every link in the chain. The European powers provided the market and the ships. African states provided the captives and the infrastructure to move them to the coast, and the colonies in the Americas provided the demand that kept the entire machine running. Each participant had its own reasons for taking part, and each was transformed by the experience. But the scale of this forced movement was unlike anything that had come before. By the time the trade declined in the 19th century, an estimated 12 million individuals had been taken from their homelands and transported across the ocean. The descendants of those who survived would go on to shape the cultures, economies, and politics of entire continents. The system that moved them was a masterpiece of logistical organization, but it was built on a foundation of human suffering that still echoes today. What made this particular form of reorganization so enduring, and what finally caused it to unravel? The answers lie in the contradictions that the system itself created. The Ottoman Empire took the logic of captive reorganization and turned it into the most fully institutionalized system the world had ever seen. It was called the Devshirme, and it created a class of soldiers and administrators whose loyalty belonged not to family or tribe, but to the Sultan alone. The process began in the villages of the Balkans, where Ottoman officials would arrive every few years with a very specific mission. They were looking for Christian boys, usually between the ages of 8 and 18, who showed promise. A boy who was strong, intelligent, or quick-witted might find himself selected, taken from his family, and marched toward the Ottoman capital. His parents, if they resisted, faced severe consequences, but for most families there was no choice. The system was a form of tribute, a tax paid in human potential. Once the boys reached Istanbul, their transformation began. They were converted to Islam and given new names. They were circumcised and taught the basic rituals of Muslim prayer. Then they entered a rigorous training program that lasted for years. They learned to read and write in Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. They studied the Quran, Islamic law, and the history of the empire. They were trained in horsemanship, archery, and the use of swords and firearms, but the training went far beyond physical and intellectual skills. It was designed to reshape the boys' very sense of identity. They were told that their old families, their old villages, and their old religion were now in the past. Their new family was the Sultan's household, their new home was the palace, their new purpose was to serve the empire with absolute devotion. The barracks where they lived were like a second home. They ate together, slept together, and trained together, forming bonds that would last a lifetime. They were taught to see themselves as part of an elite brotherhood, set apart from the rest of society. A janissary did not marry, at least not in the early centuries of the system. He did not own property or engage in trade. His entire existence revolved around his military unit and his service to the state. This total immersion created soldiers who had no conflicting loyalties. A janissary could not be bribed by a local noble because he had no connection to any local noble. He could not be swayed by family ties because his family was gone. His allegiance was to the Sultan alone, and that allegiance was absolute. But the Devshirme did not only produce soldiers. It also produced administrators. The most talented boys, those who excelled in their studies, were groomed for the imperial bureaucracy. They became scribes, treasurers, and governors, managing the vast machinery of the Ottoman state. Some rose to become Grand Viziers, the highest official in the empire, second only to the Sultan himself. This created a remarkable social mobility. A boy born into a poor Christian family in a remote Balkan village could, through talent and hard work, become one of the most powerful people in the world. His origins did not matter. His loyalty and ability were everything. This was a meritocracy, but it was a meritocracy built on forced relocation and cultural erasure. The Devshirme system served a crucial political purpose. It eliminated the power of the old aristocracy, both Christian and Muslim. In many empires, local nobles could challenge the ruler because they had their own wealth, their own armies, and their own networks of loyalty. The Ottoman Sultan solved this problem by creating a new ruling class that had no independent base of power. A janissary commander or a vizier could not threaten the Sultan because his wealth and status came directly from the palace. If the Sultan dismissed him, he was nothing. The janissaries in particular became the backbone of the Ottoman military. Their discipline, training, and loyalty made them the most feared soldiers in Europe and the Middle East. They were the first standing army in the region, paid a regular salary and housed in dedicated barracks. They fought with deadly efficiency, using firearms and siege tactics that gave the Ottomans a decisive advantage over their rivals. With the janissaries at its core, the Ottoman Empire expanded rapidly, capturing Constantinople in 1453, and pushing deep into the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa. The Devshirme system was not without its critics, even within the empire. Some Muslim scholars objected to the practice of taking Christian children and converting them, arguing that it violated Islamic principles. Some families in the Balkans lived in constant fear of the recruiters, and many tried to hide their sons or bribe officials to avoid selection. The human cost was real, and it left scars that lasted for generations. But from the perspective of the Ottoman state, the system was a triumph. It took potential enemies, the children of conquered peoples, and turned them into the empire's most loyal defenders. It created a new social class, the askari class, that was entirely dependent on the ruler, and it allowed the sultan to govern a vast, diverse empire with a level of control that few other rulers could match. This was reorganization at its most sophisticated, a machine for producing loyalty that ran for over 3 centuries. What happened, though, when that machine began to wear down? The answer reveals how even the most carefully designed systems can unravel under the weight of their own success. But even the most carefully designed systems could unravel in ways their architects never anticipated. The history of captive reorganization is filled with examples where the very populations meant to stabilize an empire instead became its greatest threat. These contradictions reveal a central mystery. Why did some captive groups accept their new roles and integrate peacefully, while others resisted for generations, sometimes rising up in violent rebellion that shook the foundations of the state? The answer lies not in the willpower of rulers, but in a delicate balance of coercion, cultural resilience, and economic conditions. When the balance tipped too far in any direction, the system broke. Consider the Great Slave Revolt led by Spartacus in the late 1st century before the Common Era. For years, the Roman Republic had been flooding Italy with captives from its conquests, funneling them into the latifundia and the mines. The system was designed to extract maximum labor while isolating workers from one another, but it created a powder keg of resentment. When Spartacus, a former auxiliary soldier enslaved after deserting, escaped from a gladiatorial training school in Capua, he did not act alone. He tapped into a vast underground network of discontent. Thousands of captives from different backgrounds, Thracians, Gauls, Germans, and others, flocked to his banner. They had no shared language or culture, but they shared a common grievance and a common enemy. The Roman state, which had built its economy on the labor of captives, suddenly faced an army of them. Spartacus led his followers on a 2-year campaign across Italy, defeating Roman legions in battle and threatening the very heart of the Republic. The revolt was eventually crushed, but not before revealing a critical weakness. The reorganization of captives into a docile workforce had failed because it relied too heavily on coercion and offered no path to belonging. The captives had nothing to lose and everything to gain by fighting back. Their cultural resilience, the memory of freedom, and the bonds formed in shared suffering gave them the cohesion the Romans had tried to destroy. A similar pattern emerged centuries later in the Abbasid Caliphate, where the Zanj Rebellion of the 9th century became one of the largest and most destructive slave revolts in history. The Zanj were captives from the Swahili coast of East Africa, brought to the marshlands of southern Iraq to work in the salt flats and sugarcane fields. Their conditions were brutal, and they were isolated in a harsh environment that made escape nearly impossible. But here the economic conditions worked against the state. The Zanj were concentrated in large numbers, and they were allowed to maintain their own communities within the labor camps. This gave them the social structure and the communication networks needed to organize a rebellion. When a leader named Ali ibn Muhammad appeared, he was able to unite them under a shared vision of justice and religious reform. The rebellion lasted for over 14 years and drew in thousands of other marginalized groups. The Abbasid state, which had calculated that the Zanj would be too scattered and too broken to resist, found itself fighting a war on its own soil. The revolt was eventually suppressed, but it exposed the danger of concentrating too many captives from a single region in one place, especially when their cultural identity remained intact and their economic situation offered no hope for improvement. On the other hand, the persistence of Jewish identity after the Babylonian exile presents a different kind of failure, one that was not violent but equally profound. The Babylonians had attempted to reorganize the Judean elite by removing them from their homeland and resettling them in the heart of the empire. They allowed the captives to maintain their customs and religion, hoping that this would keep them docile and cooperative. What they did not anticipate was that this very preservation of identity would become a source of resilience that outlasted the empire itself. When the Persians later conquered Babylon and allowed the Judeans to return to Jerusalem, many chose to stay in their new communities. They had built new lives, but they had also built a culture of memory. The stories of exile, the rituals of the Sabbath, the study of sacred texts, all became ways of preserving a distinct identity even while living under foreign rule. The Babylonian policy of reorganization had succeeded in preventing rebellion, but it had failed to erase the sense of peoplehood that made the Judeans a distinct nation. They remained a destabilizing force not through violence but through the quiet persistence of a counter-narrative. This is the central mystery. Why did some captive populations, like the Judeans in Babylon, retain their cultural identity and eventually thrive, while others, like the Gauls under Rome, were largely assimilated within a few generations? The answer involves multiple factors. Degree of coercion mattered. Systems that relied on extreme violence and isolation, like the Roman latifundia, created resentment that could explode in revolt. Systems that offered a path to integration, like the Ottoman Devshirme, were more stable, but they required the complete erasure of old identity, which many groups resisted. Cultural resilience also played a role. Populations with strong religious or literary traditions, like the Judeans, had tools to preserve their identity even in captivity. Groups with less formalized cultures were more vulnerable to assimilation. Economic conditions were equally critical. Captives who were given a stake in the system, who could own property, marry, and rise in status, were far less likely to rebel than those who were worked to death in mines and fields. The most successful reorganizations were those that found the sweet spot between coercion and opportunity, between erasure and preservation. But even the most careful calculation could go wrong. A sudden shift in economic conditions, a charismatic leader, or a moment of imperial weakness could turn a stable population of captives into a force of destruction. The empires that lasted longest were not those that crushed their captives most brutally, but those that learned to adapt, to offer new identities that felt worth adopting. And yet, the question remains, what was it about certain captive populations that made them so resistant to all efforts at reorganization? The answer, it turns out, lies not in the strategies of empires, but in the very nature of human identity itself. Historians do not rely on guesswork to understand these ancient strategies. The evidence is scattered across the earth, buried in rubble, written on clay, carved into stone, and even encoded in the bones of people who lived millennia ago. Each type of source offers a different piece of the puzzle, and when pieced together, they reveal a picture far more detailed than any single document could provide. Royal inscriptions, for example, were the official records of conquest that kings ordered carved into palace walls and mountain cliffs. The Assyrian annals, preserved on clay prisms and stone slabs, boast of deporting tens of thousands of people from defeated cities. They list the number of captives, the names of their homelands, and the regions where they were resettled. These inscriptions were propaganda, meant to glorify the ruler, but they also contained administrative details that modern scholars can cross-check against other evidence. When a prism says that 20,000 people were moved from the land of Bit Yakini to the province of Kala, and archaeological surveys later find pottery from that same region in the soil around Kala, the claim gains credibility. Census records and administrative tablets provide another layer of confirmation. In the ruins of ancient palaces, excavators have found thousands of clay tablets that record the daily operations of empire. They list rations given to workers, the names of captives assigned to specific projects, and the locations of resettled communities. One tablet from the Neo-Babylonian period mentions a group of Judean captives receiving oil and barley in the city of Alu-Shar-Sin. That dry administrative note becomes a living thread connecting the biblical story of exile to a concrete place and time. Settlement patterns also tell a story. When archaeologists survey a region, they look for changes in house styles, pottery types, and burial practices. A sudden appearance of a new kind of pottery, unlike anything local, often signals the arrival of a relocated population. In the Andes, the Inca mitmaq system left clear marks, distinct architectural styles, terraced fields built on slopes that locals had never cultivated, and irrigation canals that followed designs from the heartland. These physical traces show where people were moved, how they built their new homes, and how they transformed the landscape around them. In recent decades, genetic evidence has added a powerful new tool. Ancient DNA extracted from human remains can reveal patterns of migration and mixing that are invisible in written records. When scientists compare the genomes of individuals buried in a single cemetery over several centuries, they can see shifts in ancestry. A sudden influx of genetic markers from a distant region indicates a movement of people, not just cultural influence. For example, studies of burials in Roman Britain have shown that after the conquest, individuals with genetic ancestry from the eastern Mediterranean appeared in small numbers, likely administrators or merchants, while the local population remained largely unchanged. But in the border regions where entire tribes were relocated as part of Roman policy, the genetic picture shows more mixing. Linguistic evidence provides yet another angle. The spread of languages like Aramaic across the Near East or Quechua in the Andes can be mapped alongside known deportations. When a language suddenly appears in a region where it was not spoken before, and when historical records mention the relocation of speakers, the connection is clear. Loanwords, place names, and changes in dialect all carry the fingerprints of captive populations. A village name in central Turkey that sounds like a distant homeland in the Balkans is not a coincidence. It is a trace of the people who were moved there and who named their new home in memory of the old one. Each discovery, whether a clay tablet, a pottery shard, or a strand of ancient DNA, adds a brushstroke to a massive canvas. And the picture is constantly changing. New technologies, from high-resolution satellite imagery that reveals buried settlements to isotopic analysis that can pinpoint where a person grew up, are rewriting what we thought we knew. A site that was dismissed as a minor outpost a generation ago might today be recognized as a key node in a vast system of forced relocation. This ever-growing body of evidence does more than confirm old stories. It challenges them and raises new questions. For every case that fits the pattern, another defies easy explanation, and that is where the real mystery lies. Scholars have struggled for centuries to make sense of these patterns. Why did some empires succeed in transforming captives into loyal subjects, while others sowed the seeds of their own destruction? Over time, three main theoretical frameworks have emerged, each offering a different lens on the same puzzling history. The first is structural functionalism, a way of thinking that sees captive reorganization as a necessary mechanism for state integration. From this perspective, an expanding empire is like a living organism. It needs to absorb new territory and new people without tearing itself apart. Forced relocation, cultural assimilation, and the creation of mixed settlements were not random acts of cruelty. They were functional tools that helped the whole system run smoothly. The Assyrian practice of scattering defeated populations across the empire, for example, can be understood as a way to break down old tribal loyalties that could threaten central control. By mixing different groups together, the empire created a new social order where everyone depended on the state for protection and opportunity. In this view, the reorganization was not purely exploitative. It was a kind of social engineering that, at its best, provided stability and even upward mobility for those who adapted. The functionalist approach helps explain why such practices were so common across so many different cultures and time periods. If they did not work, rulers would have abandoned them, but this framework has a blind spot. It tends to downplay the human cost and the deliberate exploitation at the heart of these systems. That is where the second framework comes in. Marxist historians and social theorists have long argued that captive reorganization was not about stability for its own sake, but about class exploitation and what they call primitive accumulation. In simple terms, primitive accumulation is the process by which a ruling class gains control over resources and labor, often through violence and coercion, to build the wealth that powers a state or an economy. From this angle, the relocation of captives was a way to concentrate labor in the most productive sectors, like mines, plantations, and state workshops, while stripping them of any claim to the land or the tools they worked with. The Roman latifundia, for example, were not just a way to grow grain. They were a machine for extracting surplus value from enslaved people who had no rights and no bargaining power. The wealth generated by this system allowed the Roman elite to build monuments, fund armies, and dominate the Mediterranean. The Marxist lens highlights the deep inequality and violence that structural functionalism often glosses over. It reminds us that every temple, every road, every grand public building of the ancient world was built on the labor of people who had been taken from their homes and forced to work. But this framework, too, has its limits. It can reduce complex cultural dynamics to mere economics and overlook the ways in which some captive groups found agency, identity, and even power within these systems, like the Janissaries who rose to become grand viziers. The third framework comes from post-colonial theory, which focuses on the cultural and psychological dimensions of domination. Post-colonial critics argue that captive reorganization was not just about physical control or economic exploitation. It was a form of cultural violence, an attempt to erase the identities, languages, and beliefs of conquered peoples and replace them with the conqueror's own way of seeing the world. The Inca mitmaq system, for example, did not simply move people around. It systematically dismantled the spiritual and social landscapes of entire communities, replacing their local gods with Intai and their local languages with Quechua. This was a profound kind of harm that could not be measured in bushels of grain or numbers of coins. It struck at the very root of what it meant to belong to a place and a people. Post-colonial theory also emphasizes the long-term consequences of this cultural violence. Even after the empires fell, the descendants of captive populations often carried the scars of lost languages, suppressed traditions, and fractured identities. The legacy of the Spanish conquest in the Americas, for instance, is not just a story of gold and silver. It is a story of native peoples who were forced to abandon their names, their gods, and their ways of knowing the world, and who are still grappling with that loss today. This framework brings a necessary moral dimension to the analysis. It asks us to consider not just what empires did, but what they destroyed. Yet post-colonial theory can sometimes underestimate the resilience of captive populations and the ways they adapted, resisted, and even transformed the very cultures that were imposed on them. No single theory fully explains the diversity of cases we have seen. The Assyrian deportations, the Roman latifundia, the Inca mitmaq, and the Ottoman Devshirme were all examples of captive reorganization, but they were driven by different motives, took different forms, and had different outcomes. Structural functionalism illuminates the logic of integration. Marxism exposes the engine of exploitation. Post-colonial thought reveals the hidden wounds of cultural erasure. Each framework is a flashlight that illuminates one part of a dark room, but none can light up the whole space at once. The richest understanding comes from holding all three perspectives in mind, letting them challenge and refine each other. And as we continue to uncover new evidence from ancient DNA to forgotten archives, the picture grows more complex, more human, and more unsettling. The question that lingers is not just what happened, but what it means for us today. The grand strategies of rulers and the cold calculations of empires often obscure a quieter truth. For every captive listed on a clay tablet or counted in a census, there was a human being torn from everything familiar. The loss of autonomy was not an abstract concept. It was a father who could no longer protect his children, a mother who could not pass on the songs of her grandmother, a young man who would never again see the valley where he learned to hunt. The families that were separated in these relocations rarely appear in the official records. The annals of Assyrian kings boast of thousands of deportees, but they do not record the cries of a child pulled from its mother's arms or the silence of a village left empty. Understanding the human cost requires looking past the stone inscriptions and into the gaps where ordinary people once lived. The cultural trauma of these reorganizations was often deeper than the physical suffering. A community uprooted from its ancestral land lost not just its homes, but its connection to the spirits of the mountains and rivers that gave meaning to its existence. The stories that explained how the world began, the rituals that marked the passage of seasons, the language that carried the wisdom of generations, all of these were threatened when people were scattered across an empire. Forced relocation was a kind of slow erasure, a quiet violence that unfolded over decades. The children of the relocated might learn a new tongue and forget the old one. They might adopt the gods of their conquerors and abandon the shrines of their ancestors. Each generation drifted further from the world their grandparents had known until the memory of home became a half-remembered dream. Yet even in the midst of this disruption, human resilience found ways to endure. Captive communities held onto fragments of their identity through the stories they whispered to their children and the customs they practiced in secret. The Judean exiles in Babylon built new forms of worship around the study of sacred texts, preserving their faith without a temple. The descendants of Africans brought to the Americas wove the rhythms of their homeland into new musical traditions that would one day change the world. The cultural trauma was real and lasting, but it was not always total. People found ways to adapt, to resist, and to create new meanings in the ruins of the old. The ethical dimensions of these policies resist easy judgment. From the perspective of an expanding state, the reorganization of captive populations was a rational solution to the challenge of governance. It allowed for stability, economic productivity, and the spread of shared institutions. The officials who implemented these policies saw themselves not as tyrants, but as administrators solving practical problems. They were building roads, feeding armies, and maintaining order in a dangerous world. The captives themselves were often simply a resource to be managed, like land or livestock. This perspective is uncomfortable, but it is essential for understanding how such systems could persist for centuries with the support of educated and thoughtful people. Acknowledging the human cost does not mean denying the logic of the state. It means holding both truths in mind at the same time. The same roads that were built by the hands of captives connected distant communities and enabled the exchange of ideas that enriched human civilization. The same systems that caused immense suffering also created opportunities for some individuals to rise to positions of influence and power. A janissary who rose to become a grand vizier might look back on his forced childhood departure from his village as a tragedy that opened a path to greatness. A farmer relocated to a new valley might find that the soil was richer and the water more plentiful. These contradictions do not cancel each other out. They are the texture of history, messy and human. The lesson is not that empires were simply evil or simply beneficial, but that the pursuit of stability and power often came at a cost that was unevenly distributed. The people who paid the heaviest price were those who had the least voice in the decisions that shaped their lives. Their stories are harder to find in the historical record, but they are no less real. As we continue to uncover the traces of these captive populations, we are reminded that every ancient policy had a human face. The ethical question that lingers is not about judging the past from a comfortable distance. It is about recognizing the echoes of these patterns in the present. The same tensions between security and freedom, between integration and erasure, between the needs of the state and the rights of the individual, have not disappeared. They have simply taken new forms. The fingerprints of these ancient policies are still visible on the world map today. The borders we draw, the languages we speak, and the ethnic identities we claim are not natural features of the landscape. They are the accumulated residue of decisions made by rulers centuries ago, decisions about who to move, where to settle them, and how to reshape their identities. The African diaspora is perhaps the most profound example. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, a forced movement of unprecedented scale carried millions of people from West and Central Africa to the Americas. They did not go as settlers or explorers. They went as captives, sorted and sold into a system that deliberately scattered speakers of the same language and members of the same community across different colonies. A Yoruba speaker might end up in Bahia, Brazil, while an Igbo speaker from a nearby village might be sent to Virginia. The intention was control through fragmentation, but the result was something unexpected. In their new homes, these displaced populations did not simply disappear into the dominant culture. They created new identities, blending elements from different African traditions with each other and with the languages and customs of Europe and the Americas. The result is the rich cultural tapestry we see today, from the rhythms of samba and the spirituality of candomblé in Brazil to the cadences of Gullah speech on the sea islands of Georgia and South Carolina. The forced movement of captives did not erase African culture. It transformed it, spreading its seeds across an entire hemisphere and allowing them to grow in new soil. In Anatolia, a different kind of transformation unfolded. When the Seljuk Turks swept into the region in the 11th century, they did not come as empty-handed conquerors. They brought with them a population of Turkish-speaking pastoralists and warriors from the steppes of Central Asia. Over the following centuries, the Seljuks and later the Ottomans engaged in a systematic policy of demographic engineering. They relocated Turkish-speaking populations into newly conquered areas, especially in the Balkans and Anatolia, while moving or removing local Christian communities. The practice continued for generations, gradually shifting the ethnic and linguistic balance of the region. Today, the vast majority of people in what is now Turkey speak Turkish as their first language and identify as ethnically Turkish. But this was not always the case. Before the Seljuk conquest, Anatolia was a predominantly Greek-speaking Christian land, with significant Armenian, Kurdish, and other populations. The reorganization of captive and subject peoples, combined with the deliberate settlement of Turkish-speaking groups, transformed the region over centuries. The modern nation-state of Turkey, with its borders and its population, is a direct descendant of these policies. The population exchange between Greece and Turkey in the 1920s, one of the largest forced migrations of the 20th century, was itself a continuation of this long history, an attempt to untangle the demographic knots that centuries of imperial reorganization had tied. In the Americas, the linguistic map tells a similar story. Before European contact, the continent was home to hundreds of distinct languages, each spoken by a specific community in a specific territory. After the conquests, the Spanish and Portuguese authorities implemented policies of forced resettlement, gathering indigenous populations into mission towns and planned villages known as reductions. These resettlements deliberately mixed speakers of different languages, breaking up old communities and creating new multilingual spaces. Over time, the languages of the colonizers, Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French, became dominant. But the old languages did not simply vanish. They left their traces in place names, in loanwords, and in the accents of millions of speakers. The Quechua language, which the Inca had spread through their mitmaq system, survived the Spanish conquest and is still spoken by millions of people in the Andes today. The Guarani language of Paraguay, which Jesuit missionaries used as a tool for organizing resettled communities, became a national language alongside Spanish. The linguistic diversity of the modern Americas is not a random inheritance. It is the direct result of centuries of forced relocation, cultural mixing, and deliberate policies of assimilation and preservation. Even the boundaries of modern nations often reflect these ancient patterns. The border between India and Pakistan, drawn in 1947, followed a line that was shaped in part by centuries of demographic change under the Mughal and British empires. The conflict between Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda was rooted in colonial policies that reorganized social categories and moved populations to suit administrative convenience. The legacy of captive reorganization is not a distant historical curiosity. It is alive in the news, in the debates over immigration and identity, in the languages we hear on the street, and in the names we give to the places we call home. The empires that practiced these policies have crumbled into dust, but the human mosaic they created endures, a living archive of decisions made long ago that continue to shape our world in ways we are only beginning to understand. Yet, even as we trace these enduring patterns, vast gaps remain in what we actually know. For all the clay tablets, stone inscriptions, and archaeological surveys, scholars still cannot agree on the most basic numbers. How many people were actually moved during the Assyrian deportations? The royal annals boast of figures like 20,000 or 50,000, but these were propaganda, not census records. They may have been inflated to magnify the king's glory or deflated to downplay losses. Without reliable population data from the time, the true scale remains a mystery. We know that entire regions were emptied, but we cannot say with confidence how many individuals survived the march, how many died along the way, or how many integrated into their new settlements. The demographic impact of these policies is a ghost we can see but never fully grasp. Another unanswered question concerns the long-term survival of captive identities. We have clear examples of groups that held onto their sense of self for generations, like the Judean exiles whose descendants returned to Jerusalem. But what about the countless others who left no written record? When the Assyrians scattered the people of Israel's northern kingdom across their empire, those 10 tribes seemed to vanish from history. Did they eventually blend into the surrounding populations, or did they maintain a hidden identity that simply went unrecorded? The same puzzle applies to the Inca mitmaq settlements. We can see the pottery styles change and the house layouts shift, but we cannot interview the people who lived there. Did they remember their ancestral homelands, or did the next generation consider themselves simply Inca? The evidence is tantalizing but incomplete, a door that opens only a crack before closing again. Perhaps the largest gap of all concerns the role of gender in these systems. The official records are almost entirely silent on what happened to women and children in captive reorganizations. The Assyrian annals list numbers of deportees, but they rarely specify how many were men, how many were women, or how they were separated. We know that male captives were often taken for military or labor roles, while women and children were sometimes distributed as domestic servants or, in some cases, integrated into the households of the conquerors. But the details are lost. How did women experience forced relocation differently from men? Did they have opportunities to preserve cultural traditions that men did not because they were less visible to the authorities? Or were they subjected to a different kind of erasure, one that left even fewer traces in the historical record? These questions are not just academic curiosities. They point to a fundamental asymmetry in our understanding. We know a great deal about the policies of rulers and the actions of armies, but very little about the daily lives of the people who were moved. The voices of the captives themselves are almost entirely absent. They did not write their own histories. They did not leave behind inscriptions boasting of their survival. Their stories have to be reconstructed from fragments, from the bones in a cemetery that show signs of malnutrition or the pollen grains in a soil sample that reveal what crops were planted after a relocation. Every piece of evidence is a clue, but the full picture remains out of reach, and that is precisely what makes this history so compelling. It is not a closed book. It is an open investigation, one where every new discovery can overturn old assumptions. The unanswered questions are not failures of scholarship. They are invitations to keep looking, to keep questioning, to keep refining our understanding of how human societies have handled the challenge of incorporating strangers. The mystery is not a weakness, it is the engine that drives the search for answers. And that drive is what leads us back to the central truth of this entire story. The reorganization of captive populations was never a simple act of cruelty or a random byproduct of war. It was a deliberate, sophisticated strategy that allowed expanding states to transform their greatest weakness, the presence of hostile strangers within their borders, into a source of strength. From the Assyrian deportations to the Inca mitmaq, from the Roman latifundia to the Ottoman Devshirme, rulers understood that the people they conquered were not just a burden to be managed. They were a resource to be reshaped. The most successful empires did not simply destroy their enemies. They remade them, turning potential rebels into farmers, soldiers, and administrators who had a stake in the system that had taken them. But as we have seen, this strategy was never a guarantee of success. The same policies that created stability in one context could sow the seeds of rebellion in another. A system that offered a path to belonging, like the Janissary Corps, could produce fierce loyalty for centuries, while a system that relied on pure coercion, like the Roman slave plantations, could explode in devastating revolt. The difference often came down to a delicate balance. Too much integration threatened the conqueror's own identity. Too little integration left the captives with nothing to lose. The empires that lasted longest were those that learned to walk this line, offering enough opportunity to make cooperation worthwhile while maintaining enough control to prevent the captives from becoming a threat. And yet the mystery remains. How could such contradictory approaches, coercion and integration, erasure and preservation, both succeed and fail in different times and places? The answer is not a single formula that can be applied universally. It is a reflection of the deeply human factors that no empire could ever fully control. The resilience of a people's identity, the charisma of a leader who rises from the ranks of the captives, the economic pressures that shift over generations, all of these could tip the balance in ways that no clay tablet or royal inscription could predict. The story of captive reorganization is not a neat lesson in political science. It is a messy human drama full of unexpected outcomes and enduring contradictions. That is what makes this history so worth exploring. It challenges the simple stories we tell about power and resistance, about victors and victims. It reveals that the people who were moved, remade, and sometimes erased were not passive objects of history. They were agents who adapted, resisted, and created new identities in the crucible of empire. Their descendants walk among us today, speaking languages that were shaped by forced relocation, living in communities that were built on the foundations of ancient policies, and carrying cultural memories that reach back across centuries. So now I want to hear from you. Which of these cases surprised you the most? Was it the incredible sophistication of the Inca mitmaq system, the chilling efficiency of the Ottoman Devshirme, or the way the Judean exiles managed to preserve their identity in the heart of Babylon? Or perhaps it was the scale of the Atlantic trade that reorganized an entire hemisphere. Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective adds another thread to this ongoing investigation. And if you want to join us as we continue to uncover the hidden patterns that shaped our world, hit that subscribe button. There is always another mystery waiting to be explored.